Hello again to another Agricola Reacts, and today we'll be watching The Little Ice Age, because on the 31st January 2019, the Quaternary Science Reviews published a piece about that colonization of the Americas in the late 1500s killed so many people it cooled the planet and led to a little ice age. That's according to that scientific report. So let's just watch and see. I know that colonization actually did cause a lot of deaths among Native Americans there, because they weren't immune to our illnesses.
Hello and welcome to the History Chronicles. If you like our work, then please don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you'd like to support the channel in return for exclusive perks, please visit our Patreon page. Now, on with the video.
It sounds like a Marvel intro.
Today's History Chronicle begins in the winter of 1683. During this winter season, a visitor to the City of London would have noticed a particularly strange event. The River Thames, on which the city was established, was frozen solid. In fact, it was so frozen that people were walking across the river, conducting business and trading on the ice. This was one of the first ever River Thames frost fairs. There was even a circus performing out on the ice, which was a foot thick. This was the famous Chipperfield Circus, which is still in operation today. What on earth was happening? Why was the River Thames frozen so solidly? The winter in England that year became known as the Great Frost of 1683 to 1684. The River Thames Frost Fair was just one extreme product of what is now understood to have been the Little Ice Age, a dramatic cooling of the world's temperature, understood to have begun sometime between 1300 and 1500. And to have only fully ended in about 1800, as the world's temperatures began to rapidly increase, as they have done ever since.
Can you imagine seeing that though on your own thing?
The Little Ice Age is widely debated. It is typically understood to have been at its most intense in the years between 1550 and 1750, with a peak reached in the mid-17th century, right around the time of the River Thames Frost Fairs. As with the issue of dating the Little Ice Age precisely, there is considerable argument about exactly how much global temperatures fell during the period. This is a period for which there is no accurate scientific data on temperatures, as the first modern thermometer was not invented until 1709 by Daniel Fahrenheit. However, historians, archaeologists and scientists who have studied the issue generally agree that the range of the fall in temperatures was within 0.5 degrees Celsius and 2 degrees Celsius, with the most likely range being between 1 degree and 1.5 degrees, particularly during the most intense period of the Little Ice Age in the 17th century. We are already seeing how immense the fallout can be from slightly over 1 degree of warming in today's world. So a fall of 1.5 degrees for societies which were heavily reliant on rather primitive farming techniques could prove catastrophic. Various reasons have been put forward to explain how the Little Ice Age came about. One holds that there were increased tectonic shifts during this period, which in turn resulted in more volcanic eruptions worldwide, that in turn released volcanic ash into the atmosphere, which blocked out a lot of the sun's heat. Another attributes the decline to prolonged sunspot activity, known as the Maunder minimum. These sunspots have been observed as being at their most intense between 1645 and 1715, and would have served to further block solar radiation from heating the planet, and consequently would have resulted in a cooling off of the Earth's temperatures. But one potential factor in the development of the Little Ice Age, which is increasingly seen as a major contributory cause to the phenomenon, is the decline in world population, which occurred between the 13th and 16th centuries. Beginning in the 14th century, a series of catastrophic diseases struck the planet, most notably the bubonic plague, which swept across Europe, Asia,
you don't really think about that as well.
The world's people in the space of 100 years, and reducing the overall population from about 475 million to less than 400 million. This followed a period of intense warfare associated with the Mongol conquest.
Can you imagine there was only less than half a billion people living back then?
Exceptionally bloody affairs, which massively reduced the population in parts of Asia, for instance. Also the wars of Timur the Lame, who carved out a huge empire in Transoxiana, stretching from northern India to Iran and Kazakhstan in the last quarter of the 14th century, is estimated to have resulted in the deaths of tens of millions of people. This pattern is compounded during the 16th century, following the discovery of the Americas by Europeans in the late 15th century. In the 100 years that followed, the native people of the Americas were decimated, being totally unprepared to resist the new diseases that the Europeans brought with them. Of a total population of perhaps as much as 50 million when Columbus first arrived in America in 1492, it is estimated that as many as 90% of the indigenous people were wiped out, owing to diseases and warfare.
90? I knew there was a lot, I didn't think that was 90%.
Globally fell dramatically. People produce carbon simply as organisms, but the chilling effect would have primarily come from the amount of land which was returned to nature.
Yes.
With less mouths to feed all over the world, more areas which had been deforested and put under cultivation to produce crops were simply allowed to go back to nature. And as they did, more carbon was absorbed by this rewilding and taken out of the atmosphere. The impact over a period of 200 to 300 years was a cooling effect, which contributed sharply to the Little Ice Age. Whatever the root causes might have been, we can be reasonably precise about what the impact of this on human populations was. Our best documented evidence comes from Europe. Perhaps the earliest indication that the Little Ice Age was coming occurred at the very beginning of the 14th century, when the Baltic Sea froze over twice. Events like this
have
grave implications for Europe's food supplies, not just in terms of fishing, but also because throughout the late Middle Ages and early modern period, Western European countries such as England, Holland and Germany were reliant for much of their diet on grain crops,
coming from
the Baltic States region and transported west through the Baltic Sea. Further to the north, Iceland experienced considerable freezing all around its coastline as a result of the cold weather, impacting significantly on its ability to trade with the wider world and isolating it from its European neighbours. But the major issue was famine. Serious famines were a result of harvest failures brought about by the declining temperatures which abounded throughout the 16th and 17th centuries in countries such as France, Germany, Denmark, Sweden and Norway. Some of these were most severe in the final quarter of the 17th century, resulting in the loss of perhaps 5% to 10% of the overall populations of these countries, in particular in regions which were the worst affected, such as the north of France. And then there was the domino effect of such harvest failures. It is generally assumed that social and political unrest is tied to harvest failures and increases in the prices of basic commodities and food staples.
Yeah, because the least there is, the more expensive it's gonna be, and the poor people won't be able to.
Maghreb and the Middle East. The same applied in early modern times, during the 1610s, when a wave of harvest failures caused widespread food scarcity throughout Western and Central Europe, and this in turn saw a rise in the price of basic foodstuffs. Historians are now generally agreed that this development was a contributory factor in the outbreak of the worst war seen in Europe before the Napoleonic Wars of the early 18th century. The 30 Years' War broke out in 1618 in the territories of the Austrian Habsburgs, in what is now the Czech Republic, but which was then known as Bohemia. It would quickly spread throughout all of Austria and Germany as well, before eventually involving most of the great European powers, including France, Spain, Denmark, the Dutch Republic, and Sweden. By the time the war ended in 1648, it is estimated that between 15 and 20 million people had died, mostly in Central Europe, but only a fraction of these casualties were the result of direct military combat. The majority were due to other factors, and one of the principal amongst these was starvation and attendant malnutrition diseases. Problems also arose beyond Europe. Even Africa, a continent which is heavily exposed to global warming in modern times, but which one would assume would not have suffered much as a result of a slight drop in global temperatures, experienced its own trouble. Any change in the normal temperatures of a specific region can lead to imbalances in its regional geographic conditions. The Little Ice Age appears to have impacted the quality of the drinking water available from Lake Chad, and as a result, the lives of communities in proximity to this giant water system were impacted. In the city of Timbuktu, which in the 14th and 15th centuries was the center of a vastly wealthy kingdom, there was a trade route crossroads between West Africa and the Maghreb and the Middle East. The river Niger flooded 13 times during the years of the Little Ice Age, an occurrence which has no other parallel in human history in that region. The Little Ice Age might also have contributed to the period of intense crises associated with the protracted collapse of the Ming dynasty in China during the 17th century. Overall, the transition from Ming rule to Qing rule resulted in an estimated 25 million deaths between 1618 and 1683. The Qing dynasty originated in
3
Manchuria
years?
in northeastern China.
25
a region
million
which was
people died in 3
particularly
years?
affected by harvest failures in the 17th century.
Yeah, that's what happens when you
Despite
have
this,
the weather
Ming
changes.
emperors did not
It goes all
reduce
over the
levels
world,
of
doesn't it?
taxes and tributes expected from the region, and many scholars have speculated that it was resentment at these actions during this period of harvest failures that incited the Manchurian revolt against Ming rule in the first place, and the subsequent start of a long 65-year war of conquest. Finally, some of the impacts of all this temperature change might be thought unusual. One example is informative, as during the 16th and 17th centuries, Europe was struck by the witch craze, as tens of thousands of people, largely unmarried women, were accused of witchcraft before being tortured and possibly killed by members of their own communities. Accusations of witchcraft acted as a release of social tensions when local communities went through hard times, such as harvest failures or strange weather patterns.
Because that's what happens.
As events like these abounded
There's something
in
bad
the 16th
happening,
century,
start
it was
blaming others.
increasingly believed that magic and occultism associated with witches was responsible for the suffering of communities who suffered from harvest failures. Consequently, the Little Ice Age, in its own strange way, is increasingly seen as having contributed to the witch craze, which coursed through early modern Europe. This cascade of impacts associated with the Little Ice Age has sometimes led scholars to argue that we can speak about a general crisis of the 17th century, one in which the pressures of war, harvest failures, economic difficulties, political instability, and myriad other issues created a situation in which governments were teetering on the brink of collapse, certainly in a state of profound crisis. This was acutely the case in Europe, where the 30 Years' War sowed devastation across the continent between 1618 and 1648. But it is now increasingly understood that the general crisis was also occurring in Asia and elsewhere. Thus, the Little Ice Age stands as a striking example of how changes in global temperatures can impact on human societies. Admittedly, in the early modern period, these changes resulted in colder weather patterns, while in our own age we are seeing the direct opposite, owing to how much carbon human beings are pumping into the atmosphere. But the problems which were created by the Little Ice Age for human societies at the time should stand as a stark warning for our own times about the folly of failing to prevent extreme changes in weather patterns. You have been watching the History Chronicles. We'd love to know what you think of the Little Ice Age. Please let us know below, and if you enjoyed our video, please give us a like and subscribe. It really helps us out. Also, if you'd like to support our work going forward, please visit our Patreon page, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next episode of the History Chronicles.
Okay. I mean, I always knew about the Native Americans dying after the colonization started, but I never thought that was 90%. I always thought that was maybe like, I don't know, 50-60% that people died, not 90. That kind of explains why there's only like, was it 2% of Native Americans living in America right now, according to some of the censuses from past years. That's just crazy. But then the 25 million dying just in 3 years in China from war as well. Yeah, that's a lot of people that just gone, gone. And kind of explains that Little Ice Age. Basically, less CO2 in the air makes it everything colder. It's I don't know what else to think about. But it just, everything have this kind of like a domino effect. One thing happens and then another thing happens because of that happened, and then another thing happens because that second thing happened. It's just everything's connected in the environment. So there's gonna be less people, there's gonna be less space needed for them to live, less space needed for them to farm, to feed themselves. And then that's gonna just make more wildlife and more trees, and yeah, that actually makes much sense in my opinion. What do you think? Because that's what I think. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.